and welcome to our lecture. I'm Professor Trevor Miller, and I hope you're having a wonderful week. Today we're going to be studying World War I and the progressive movement in the United States. We're going to be discussing foreign policy, America in World War I, the women's suffrage movement and its successes during World War I, and we're going to be discussing the Treaty of Paris. Interestingly, though, in this image is Eugene Bullard, who was an African American who traveled to France and became a World War I flying ace. When America wouldn't allow him to fly, France would, and he became one of France's most highly decorated pilots. So as we study chapter 22, by the end of the chapter, you should be able to identify what Wilson's foreign policy was, what role the United States played in World War I, what life was like on the home front, what Woodrow Wilson did during the Paris Peace Conference, and why America's transition from war to peace was so turbulent. Again, these lectures are designed to assist your learning from the textbook, not replace it. As Wilson took office, his administration decided it was going to continue the tradition of following the Monroe Doctrine. This had four tenets. 1. The U.S. would not interfere in any European affairs. 2. The U.S. would not interfere in European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. 3. The U.S. would not allow Europe to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. And 4. The U.S. would consider any European interference in the Western Hemisphere a provocative or hostile act. So what this essentially meant was that the U.S. was going to mind its business, and the U.S. expected Europe to mind their own. And any interference in our hemisphere would be a provocative or an act of war. However, Wilson didn't always abide by the policy he set forward. There are four different instances here where he authorized an invasion of a foreign country in our hemisphere to meet its own needs. Depicting the actions the United States took in Latin America during this window. While this graphic goes before and after this window, it shows you how many different engagements the U.S. was involved in during this time period. One of those major engagements on that previous slide, was the invasion of Haiti. At the request of the U.S. government, the United States sent Marines to Haiti to pacify the population and to help support the failing democracy. However, through the modern historical lens, the New York Times has reported that essentially, at the request of the company that preceded Citibank, the United States was sent into Haiti, basically to help pilfer the finances of the government. And here we have General Smedley Butler, who said, "I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect revenues." He described himself as a racketeer for capitalism. So he's admitting after the fact that he helped the United States Citibank swindle Haiti and Cuba. So while the U.S. was busy keeping its domestic and close international affairs in order, in Europe there's the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, sparking a wave of violence across Europe, setting in motion World War I. Here's a graphic depicting the alliances throughout Europe during World War I. Please note that in green are the Allied powers: Great Britain, France, Portugal, Italy, Russia, Greece, Serbia, Romania, where we have the Central Powers: Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and then you have several neutral countries. Now note, this map does not include the United States, as the United States was neutral during the initial phase of this. President Wilson immediately proclaimed that the U.S. would stay neutral as this crisis in Europe unfolded. The United States did not want to get involved in this affair. It considered it a European affair, and the U.S. was going to mind its own business. However, there were those within the U.S. that wanted to get involved in the war. There were sinkings of several ships throughout the Atlantic where Americans had died, and several people, several senators, had wanted the U.S. to get involved in the war. Wilson refused. However, Germany thought that they could distract America by creating a war on its southern border with Mexico. There was a telegram that was intercepted that essentially Germany was encouraging Mexico to attack the United States, and in return, when Germany won the war in Europe, it would give Mexico its former territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Now, this infuriated the American population, and Wilson signed in a Selective Service Act, creating a draft in the United States. By the end of the draft, there were nearly 5 million Americans serving in the military. And as the U.S. went to war in Europe, the first major engagement of U.S. forces was a unit of African American soldiers from the 92nd Division. They saw more combat, 191 days of combat, than any other unit in the war, and they earned more citations for gallantry and bravery of duty than any other unit of the war. I found this incredibly interesting. Now, while the war was unfolding in Europe, things were still progressing within the United States, especially along the front of women's suffrage. While the crusade for women's suffrage began long before World War I, even before the Civil War for that matter, they were making headway, the women's suffrage movement. In 1916, the Republicans endorsed giving women the vote. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat, endorsed the right to vote. And then in 1920, after the war, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting white women the right to vote in the United States. Labor, too, changed while the war was unfolding. There was an 8-hour workday that was passed into law. Minimum wage became federal law. Union membership across the country exploded. However, there were some negative changes at home. The rights to free speech against the government were suspended in many cases. In Russia, there was the Bolshevik Revolution, which created an environment where anything that was pro-democracy was feared, or anything other than pro-democracy was feared. This helped spark a Red Scare, the first in our country's history. Journalists and protesters around the country, anyone who spoke out against the war or democracy, was detained as well. The war ended. President Wilson went to Paris to be part of the Accords. He identified a 14-point plan that he felt could create an environment to promote peace and democracy and egalitarianism around the world. Wilson fought to create this entity called the League of Nations. However, the Allies refused to join many parts or support many parts of the plan. The Allies had, especially France, had pushed to punish Germany for the war, punish Germany almost exclusively for the war. And in 1920, Congress voted against it, citing it would give away too much power to the League of Nations. Lesson today, we talked about the conditions that led to World War I, U.S. foreign policy before World War I, America's involvement in World War I, the women's suffrage movement during the era, and the Treaty of Paris. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you're having a